Hey friends, Kambria Evans here today to talk about EMDR for depression. Now, just like we covered in our last episode, EMDR for anxiety, I want us to really get nuanced and curious today about when EMDR works for depression and when it doesn't. Because when someone tells me we can't do something, I get really curious. So we're going to unpack some of the myths about some clinicians who might say EMDR doesn't work for depression. EMDR is for trauma. And what's so interesting about the Venn diagram between trauma and depression is that depression is a symptom of trauma. And as we've been talking about in this series, we now understand that trauma is too narrowly defined, right? EMDR works for trauma, but EMDR works for stressful life events. It works for transitions. It works for all sorts of things. It works for anything where our mind and body are trying to become congruent, either through the 3 prongs of time, past, present, and future, or just trying to get congruent about confusing curriculum, shocking life events happening, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be something life-threatening, right? So we have expanded our definition of trauma. And because of that, we're expanding our definition of what we can use EMDR for, which is very exciting. And why is this important? It's important because I don't want anyone to be turned away or not referred to utilize EMDR because they don't either identify as having had trauma, what's happening for them isn't defined as trauma by the DSM, right? Trauma is subjective. And as we talked about in our last episode, Gabor Mate taught us, right, that trauma isn't what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us. So given that we are the ones who feel our own feelings, given that we are the ones that live in our own body, it makes sense that the definition of trauma should be subjective and it should be decided by each individual person. Yeah, that felt traumatic for me. Or because we've been taught trauma means something like going off to war or, having an assault. If our brains don't understand that what we're feeling is traumatic for us, right? We might disqualify ourselves for a trauma modality like EMDR. So I'm hoping that this series is expanding options for you, expanding the way that you see yourself and the world, and expanding the resources available to you, okay? Beautiful. Okay, so what is depression? Okay, depends who you ask. Let's think about all the answers someone might give us on this very juicy question. Now, depression is a feeling, right? Depression is a diagnosis in the DSM. There's all sorts of different kinds of depression, right? There's like dysthymia, which is like chronic depression. There's mild depression, moderate, severe. There's all sorts of gradations of depression. And what's interesting about depression is that it can manifest in so many different emotions just beyond sadness. It's kind of like, I think, one of the categories other than trauma that takes up a lot of space on the feeling wheel chart, right? So you guys have seen those feeling wheels that have like the core 6 emotions in the middle with kind of the more nuanced variations of those emotions coming out. And I love that these are like all over Etsy because I think it's great to educate people about how many feelings we actually have available to us to feel and name and understand and communicate. And so what's interesting about depression is that it's not just sadness. Depression can manifest as fatigue. It can manifest as anger. It can manifest as like sobbing and crying, right? Depression can manifest as none of those things and can completely manifest as body sensations only, which is amazing. So depression can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And it's all dependent on how our bodies are wired and what was learned or decided growing up, right? Because we were all given a curriculum, we were given a set of rules by our primary caregivers. And they taught us that there were certain things you could do and certain things you couldn't do that would ensure that you got secure attachment, right? And we'll be diving into attachment trauma in our next episode. And what I'll say about it for now is that kids, whether they're conscious of it or not, they learn the rules and they learn what they have to do and not do in order for them to continue or try to feel securely attached to their caregivers, connected, right? Loved and safe. That's it. That's literally the motivation of all people, okay? So when we think about what depression is and what it's not, I want us to think about it first as a pendulum swing from anxiety. Now, what does that mean? So depression can look like a collapse. And sometimes, for some of us, if you watch the last episode about anxiety, we talked about how anxiety can be a cadence that lives inside your body. And eventually, we crash. We go into a collapse state. And for a lot of us who run on this cadence, or this cadence feels familiar to us, this is a cadence that we have been in for a long time, right? Where we're going, crash. And what's really cool about your body and your nervous system is that, like, thank God it does this. Like, thank God your body knows I can't have that cadence forever because I'm physically going to start to feel like the burnout of it, right? And so our body gets tired and it puts us in a collapse. And a lot of us cannot even realize that we typically have a cadence that's fast. Maybe because of the area that we live in. I live here in Silicon Valley. It's very, very common to have a very fast cadence. And maybe that's so normalized that we don't even realize we're moving that fast. And so when we go into a collapse state, we can call it burnout, we can call it collapse, we can call it depression, fatigue. When we go into those places, it makes sense, right? It makes sense. And so you can understand how someone might walk into their physician's office or therapist's office and be told, well, you have depression. And this is why it's so important for clinicians to really zoom out and understand the context of what's happening for this person, because we all have these really incredible responses to trauma and responses to the world. This is like biological evolutionary stuff, right? And you've heard about these a million times on social media, but I'll say them again just so we're all on the same page, which is we have freeze, or our body just freezes, which we see in animals, right? I'll never forget when my dog was in the backyard and I saw my dog and I saw a possum. And this possum had never been in our yard before. And I thought, oh, I know where this is going. Just like the squirrels. And what happened instead was my dog raced towards the possum and the possum just froze. So the possum played possum and froze. And it worked, right? We see this in nature all the time. So humans have the ability to freeze, and it's a good thing we have it because it can help us sometimes. Even though we think about it as like a negative response to trauma, this is just what our bodies try to do to help us, right? So we have freeze, and then we have flight, which is get me out of here, run away. Okay, it's the urge to move towards safety. And a lot of us that have a cadence that we might call anxiety or anxious, really often what that is it's trauma stored in the body. It's a flight response that's stuck, that didn't get to complete when something was happening that was worthy of running away from before, something traumatic, okay? So we have freeze, we have flight, right? We have fight, which is the urge to fight and protect in the moment. And now we have fawn, which is kind of like essentially like emotionally manipulating the situation, people pleasing to survive, to get what you need. And a lot of kids had to learn this growing up too, because fight wasn't an option. Flight's not an option. Where are you going to go, right? And I like to think about this response also of, it's, I guess, like a version of freeze, but just like a collapse. And you'll hear about this a lot. I'm a trauma therapist here in California. A lot of my clients who have had assaults, who have had really horrific things happen to them, they will have gone into a freeze response or a collapse, right? And it's interesting to think about depression as a collapse. And when we are, as kids, when we learn that going into a collapse has a promise of safety in it, right? We tend to use that as our go-to strategy. So when people come and work with me for depression, what I'm already thinking about as a trauma therapist is this truly like a biological wiring issue? Like, does this person not have enough serotonin and dopamine? Like, are their neurotransmitters not enough or too slow? Like, is there a medical issue, like hormonal, or do they have sleep apnea? I can't tell you how many clients have come and seen me for anxiety and depression and fatigue, and they just can't breathe at night, so they're tired. And then once they get a CPAP or surgery, they feel amazing. So I'm always thinking of like, is this something permanent? Because that's pretty rare, right? Chemically, biologically. Is this something that medically can be treated by someone on our team? And if we kind of cross those things off, I'm thinking, is this trauma related? Like, is this something that was learned or decided before, right? Was there an episode or many episodes as a kid where there was something scary, unsafe, unsettling, disturbing, and this kid went into a collapse, a depression? Or is this a part holding sadness? Okay. And the reason I kind of differentiate those things between a collapse to get some safety and a part holding sadness typically depends on how the symptoms of depression present, right? So if I have someone coming in hot and they're depressed, but their depression manifests as rage, I'm getting real curious about past trauma. I'm getting real curious about what was learned or decided. I'm getting real curious about fight responses and what's connected to that from the past or the present, because EMDR can target those things, desensitize them cognitively and in the body, make the mind and body congruent. And these identities people carry, like, I'm depressed, I'm rageful. No, you're not. Your body is just trying to take care of itself in the way that it knows how, in the way that it learned before. So depression's so nuanced. When someone comes in and they can't get out of bed, there's no energy there. I'm thinking all the medical stuff on the differential diagnosis list. Let's make sure that's all legit and squared up. And then I'm thinking to myself, where did this person learn or decide to collapse so intensely that it actually created safety for them? A lot of this might be pre-verbal trauma, which means that there are things that happen to us before we can even make complete narrative memories, right? Like this morning, you woke up, you ate something, you might have had some coffee, you drove in your car, and if someone asks you, how was your morning, you could put together a story for them so that they understood how it was. There's pictures, there's words, there's a narrative of the world that makes sense. For pre-verbal trauma, this is stuff that happened before we could put words together. So when you can't put words together and you don't even have a sense of the world to make a narrative about what's happening to you, all of that information's in your body. All of it. The body keeps the score. And so when someone comes in and they can't get out of bed, and they can't take a shower, and there's no energy there, and they're in a full collapse, right? I'm getting really curious about pre-verbal trauma. I'm getting really curious about why the body feels safest there. And the client's not going to know. This is the trickiest part, I think. And I think probably one of the most important parts of today. The client isn't going to know they have pre-verbal trauma. It might even be memories that are stored over here, right? They're not on the front burner. They're not on the back burner. They're back in the storage closet where we don't even remember what's in there. Like, close the door, goodbye. So if someone has fragmented memories of trauma where they were in a collapse state, if someone has pre-verbal trauma where all little kids can do is really freeze or go into a collapse state, it would make sense that the wiring tells this person, go into a collapse state when things are stressful, when things are traumatic, when things are hard, when there's any trigger related to anything that happened to you. It can be a color. It could be a smell. It could be the way someone looks at you. It could be getting in the car. It can be anything because our brains link information together all the time, right? And our brains typically want to go towards information, towards memories that need to be soothed. And so I think this is why when people have such debilitating depression, that might be preverbal, that might be collapse, I think this is why it's so missed. They're just kind of labeled like, oh, you have severe depression. So here is some medication. Now, y'all know that I am not anti-medication at all. Where I get sad, where I feel like we can do better as clinicians, is that if we all understood as clinicians about preverbal trauma, if all the talk therapists understood that the body keeps the score and that when someone's coming into our office and we're just staying in the neocortex and talk, all we're doing is just activating their trauma, activating their depression. And we're not getting subcortical. We're not going down into the body to do the work in the body. And even if the body doesn't have anything there to feel or it's dissociated, like a lot of people with depression have dissociation where they're just kind of zoned out, spaced out, tired, can't get out of bed, right? These are all protective adaptations to being scared, being stressed, being overwhelmed, right? This is one way to clinically understand. And so if you're listening to this and you've been told you have depression and you have had the traumatic experience of incorporating this as part of your identity that you will have forever, right? And maybe you're taking medication and maybe it helps you feel less of the depression. Maybe it helps you get out of bed, take a shower, right? But it also doesn't give you full access to your joy or any other feeling because it kind of just takes the edge off and numbs everything, right? You might want to get curious about finding an EMDR clinician who has the ability to get curious with you about what's happening in your body. Or if nothing's happening in your body, this part of you that knows how to go into a collapsed state. Because think about this with me. Depression is awful. It is awful. People feel embarrassed, they feel ashamed, they feel worthless. Like there's so many heartbreaking negative cognitions that go with this kind of depression. And I think that there's also a sense of safety, and bear with me on this, that if we're in a collapsed state and we're in our bed, right, it is possible that a part of us feels cocooned, feels safe, feels like I can't have anything bad happen to me here. I can't be more of a failure. Like I'm at least just here. Nothing can hurt me here. It already hurts. And so people get stuck in this. They get stuck in this. Now, again, I'm giving y'all multiple explanations of how to understand depression. And again, this is a really complicated topic because there's so many feelings associated with depression, right? Fatigue, rage, sadness, feeling nothing, right? Tired. So if any of this is landing on you and you're getting curious about it, I'm glad because you deserve to be curious about the things you've been told about yourself, okay? You deserve to be curious about how someone's given you a sense of your identity as a person who has an emotional experience in the world. And you deserve to consider, if you haven't already, that EMDR works for depression because EMDR works with the body, works with preverbal trauma that you may or may not even know happened, right? Works with parts that have adapted to put you in a collapsed state, okay? A lot of my clients over the 7 years I've been here in my practice in California have oftentimes described, there's like this theme of depression as kind of like a dark place, like a dark cave, which is sad and painful and hard to be in. And also there's a safety there. Okay. So if you're a clinician and you're noticing, like, tell me about depression. Tell me what it's like for you, right? I want you to kind of put this framework on to see if you're missing something for your client so that they can get out of it. They can get out of that stuck collapsed space. Okay. So I just want to say that, there's hyperarousal and hypoarousal, right? Anxiety, depression. And it's very common when we have things upsetting happen to us, whether we want to call it trauma or stress or disturbance, it's very common that we stay stuck on or off, right? We can stay stuck on in anxiety, right? Or we can stay stuck off in depression, like just the collapse. And both of these places have benefits, right? And both of them have consequences. And so here's what I want to say about this. And this is a very sensitive topic that I take very seriously. Sometimes when people are in depression, when they're stuck off, right, it is not uncommon to feel hopeless. And sometimes a part of that person, might be a little part, might be a big part, will feel like they want to die, will say, I want to die. And what I want to listen for and be curious about as a trauma therapist is, okay, where was that learned or decided from the past? Because when we have trauma we don't remember, when we have preverbal trauma especially, right? When we're so little and something happens to us, a part of us that's holding the terror and the hopelessness and the I can't fight, right? And the I have to collapse. When a part of us is holding all of that, it would make a lot of sense that that part wanted to die. Of course it did, right? What that part went through was horrible. It's horrific, right? Especially for a little person. So when I hear that someone wants to die, I get really, really curious and I validate, right? I can understand that a part of you doesn't want to feel like this anymore. Totally get it. And I can understand that a part of you needs so much soothing that this part doesn't even think is possible, that it would feel better to die than try to figure out how to soothe this part, because you've been trying to figure out how to soothe this part for maybe decades. And there's no greater joy for me as a therapist to be able to completely give somebody a new experience of themselves, to have someone come in with dark, depressive, suicidal thoughts and to work and do EMDR, to process some preverbal trauma, to process adaptations that put them in collapse, to understand themselves, whether they're pendulum swinging from anxiety and that's what we have to work on instead. There's no greater joy for me to actually shock someone and have them completely have a new identity of self. Because when we feel depressed or sad or rageful or tired or whatever, however our depression manifests, if this happens as a teenager, if this happens in our 20s or 30s, we kind of most of the time get labeled as I have depression or I'm a depressive person. And that can literally traumatize someone to live their lives in a way that doesn't have to be lived, right? Because you're living like that with a sense of like, this is permanent. This is who I am. And I have to accept that. So then you're forced to grieve yourself. It's horrible. And so I think that EMDR clinicians really, if you could take on the idea that I could work with depression, it's a trauma symptom. And even if there's no clear trauma, right? That doesn't matter. I can work with the body. Okay. So I want to put this out there for those of us that are coming into winter. Therapist's busiest time is the winter. And that's not coincidence, right? It's typically because cold, rain, shorter days, darker days are coming in, and the sun literally nourishes a lot of us. And it like lights us up, right? It's not an accident I live in sunny California and not, rainy Portland. The sun impacts us, especially if we're sensitive to like our surroundings. And when winter comes in, and it's cold and our body just naturally kind of wants to collapse. And not to mention just all the stress and the busyness of holidays, all the triggers that come with going to see our families or not going to see our families and what that brings up for us. And so I feel like it's a respectful progression for the next episode to talk about why EMDR is so wonderful for the winter holidays. because it can bring up so many things. It can bring up anxiety. It can bring up depression. It can bring up trauma, relational trauma, right? The relationships we wish we had with primary caregivers or our family of origins, the relationships we wish we had currently that may or may not be there the way that we'd hoped. The holidays brings up so much because we've been inundated with movies and TV shows about what the holiday season is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to feel like, okay? And so a lot of us struggle with like not enoughness over the holidays, right? So I'm going to dive into all of that next episode because I feel like it's timely, it's important, it needs to be talked about. But I hope that today was getting you at least curious about if you have been told you have depression or someone you love has been told they have depression. I hope it's getting you motivated to advocate for you or that person to go try EMDR and to find a clinician who understands not just EMDR, but preverbal trauma, who understands that adaptations can make us collapse, right? A part of us that learned that, oh, if I collapse, I'll be safe. And then that part wants to jump in and help when things get hard. There's so much there to explore. And yes, there are some people who are wired to be more depressive because of different chemicals or wiring or biology. There are some people who are working through medical issues, whether it's hormonal, sleep apnea, other things that can create a feeling of depression for them. And that's okay as long as you understand that the blanket diagnosis of depression should not take away your right to have a comprehensive differential diagnosis, which means there should be a list of possible things to try before we decide this is who you are forever. You deserve that. You deserve that this holiday season. So as always, I appreciate being thoughtful with y'all, and I look forward to being together next week. And until then, please be well.